The reason why we run into trouble translating this word, then this word, then this word, then putting a period is because the words in Hebrew can be in a lot of different orders. The order of the words doesn't matter in Hebrew. It doesn't determine what a word is doing necessarily. But in English, if you put this word first, then it's understood that the subject is here. If you put this word next, it's understood that this is the direct object. That's opposite from Hebrew. In Hebrew, the word after the verb is usually the subject, not the direct object. So we have to go through some steps. First, we have to identify each word and gloss it. Then we have to parse it. Actually, we probably have to parse it before we gloss it. We have to identify each word, parse it, gloss it, and then ask what its function is. What is it doing in the sentence? Is it the verb that's telling us the action? Is it the subject that's telling us who's doing the action? Is it the direct object, which is telling us who is receiving the action of the verb? Only then, once we've determined the function of each word, can we now transition to translation, where we go through and we ask first for the function. Give me the subject first. Okay, let's go find our subject, Hamelech. Okay, put the king in. Give me your verb next. What's our verb? Zakar, remembered. Okay, put remembered in. Okay, subject, verb. Then give me your direct object. Here's your direct object. We put that in. Same for number 4. What's your subject? We already decided in our parsing, in our function, that ha'elim. So give me ha'elim, the gods. All right, what's your verb? Shalachu. All right, sent. All right, what's your direct object? Et hanavi, the prophet. So you see how there's this 2-stage process to translation where we have to analyze the Hebrew sentence, and then we can shift over to asking for English translations. All right. Hopefully that's helpful. If not, let me know if you have any questions. Let's take a look at these sentences here in the Furtado exercises for lesson number 7. I want to take a careful look at how Hebrew sentences work differently than English sentences. So we talked about this in a previous video conference, and I'll probably put a link to that, a link to the specific discussion of this in the description. But what I want to point out is the way that we translate is we have to ask questions about what a particular word is doing in the sentence. And so that's when we talked about what a subject is. A subject answers the question, who or what is the sentence about? Who or what is the sentence talking about? The predicate is, what about them? What does this sentence say about who or what it's talking about? And so within a predicate, you have the verb, that's the main element of the predicate. You can also have things like direct objects, adverbs, prepositional phrases, that sort of a thing. So when we look at a Hebrew sentence, we want to ask ourselves not only what type of word is this? Is this a verb? Is this a noun? We want to ask, what is that verb or noun doing in the sentence? So if we look at number 1 here, we have Zachar hamelech et ha malchut. Zachar, we can see pretty obviously, is our main verb, and this conforms to the typical word order that Furtado talked about. Typical word order in Hebrew, especially Hebrew narrative, is the verb comes first, then you get the subject noun in particular, and then you get the direct object and then other elements of the sentence. It's not always in that order, but that's the typical order. And so when you come across different nouns in a sentence, you have to ask yourself, is this noun functioning as the subject? Is this noun functioning as the direct object? Is it functioning some other way? Because there's a lot of different functions that a noun can have in a sentence. So looking at number 1, Zachar hamelech et hamalchut. Zachar means remembered. It's implied that the subject of remembered is third person masculine singular. So if we don't have an explicit subject, which we don't have to have in Hebrew, we could just have Zachar et hamelech. If we don't have an explicit subject, we can use in English, because English requires an explicit subject, we can just use the 3ms pronoun, he. All right, so we could say he remembered, but Zachar really means remembered. Now that we have our verb, we have to ask ourselves, especially in the case of a third-person verb, do we have an explicit subject in this sentence? So now that we've seen the verb, we're going to look for nouns. And we have 2 nouns. We have hamelech and we have hamalchut. And we have to ask for each of these. What is the function of this noun in the sentence? Now, right at this point in Hebrew, we're pretty much talking about 2 different functions of nouns. We're talking about the subject and the direct object. We will learn when we get to construct, we will learn about the genitive function, which tends to be sort of a descriptive function or something like that. But right now we have 2 main functions. So a Hebrew sentence doesn't have to have a subject. So it's possible that neither of these nouns is functioning as the subject. But if they're not the subject, if neither is the subject, then what are they? Well, we can tell immediately that this noun is the direct object. How do we know that? We know that because of the et particle here. Et marks your definite direct object. If you see et, you know that the word that follows it is your definite direct object. Now, I'm saying definite direct object because that's what et marks. Definite is not a function. Okay, so function-wise, there's not a difference between a definite direct object and a direct object that may not be definite. Function-wise, direct object is the function, the full function here. But with et here, it's obvious that this is the direct object. If you didn't have et, and you didn't have the definite article on malchut or on melech, then it would be ambiguous. One of the nouns is probably the subject, and one is probably the direct object. But the context of the sentence would have to tell you, does it make more sense for a king to remember something, or does it make more sense for a kingdom to remember something? Well, obviously it makes more sense for a king to remember, but it is possible if you personify kingdom, like the kingdom mourned the loss of their king. Kingdoms can do things if they're personified. But here in this sense, it probably would make more sense to say a king remembered a kingdom rather than a kingdom remembered a king. Both are, seriously, both are possible, but one is more likely than the other. And that's what we use context to determine which translation is more likely to be the intention of the author. Now, I translate both of those indefinitely because the fact that we have definite articles on these two nouns tells us a lot about their function, sort of coincidentally. All right, circumstantially, we see a lot going on with, or circumstantially, we can tell a lot about the function of these nouns because if the direct object is definite, it's almost certainly going to have this et particle, which means that not only do we know that ha malchut is the direct object, but we know that ha melech is not the direct object because it is definite, but it doesn't have eight. Now, if it wasn't definite, it also wouldn't have eight, and that wouldn't tell us anything about whether it was the direct object or not. But since it's definite, since that article is there, and et is not there, we know that it is not the direct object. So what else could it be? Well, at this point, the only other function really that we've learned, and in context, the only other function that really makes sense, is that ha melech is serving as the subject. And that's why we would translate this not as he remembered the king, the kingdom, because that is deceptive word order in English. English doesn't use word order the same way, so we couldn't say he remembered the king, the kingdom, or even remembered the king, the kingdom. That doesn't work. We have to ask ourselves, which word is the subject? And let's say there is no subject. Let's look at number 2. Lachakti na'ar. There is no subject here in Hebrew. But when we translate into English, English requires a subject. And since there is no explicit subject in Hebrew, we have to use the 1CS pronoun based on the verbal form. So we would translate this as I took. Took what? Na'ar. I took a boy, I took a servant, something like that. But here, we ask ourselves, do we have an explicit subject? And ha melech really seems to be the explicit subject. For one, it's in the location that we would expect a subject to be. It's right after the verb. Okay, that's where we usually expect the subject to be if there is one. If there's not, then obviously the next word won't be the subject. You might have the direct object there. For example, we expect the subject to be in the second position, right after the verb. But here, obviously na'ar is not the subject because na'ar would not take a 1CS verb. A boy would be third person. He took. But this isn't he took, this is I took. So na'ar can't be the subject because it doesn't agree in gender and number with the verb. We also talked about agreement in that earlier video. All right, so all of this I'm trying to build up to the question that I received for number 4 here. But again, in Hebrew, we want to identify all the parts of the sentence before we really start translating, because English is going to ask us to go back into the Hebrew and look for a particular word first, which may not have been the first word in Hebrew, and then put it into English. So now that we know what all these words mean, Zachar, remembered, Hamelech, the king, Et Hamalchut, the kingdom, we now ask, what are each of these words doing in the Hebrew sense? What is their function? Zachar is the main verb. Hamelech, this is a noun. What's its function? Probably subject, because right now our two real options are subject and direct object, and since it's definite, if it were the direct object, it would have et, and it does not, so it's not the direct object. What else is left? Subject. Does it agree with Zachar? Is it third person? Yes. Is it masculine? Yes. Is it singular? Yes. This is a great candidate for our subject, so we'll just put a note here that this is our subject. And then what about et hamalchut? Well, et right here tells us the function. This noun is the direct object. All right, so we can put a V here for our verb, S here for our subject, DO for our direct object if we want. Now we can begin our translation. All right, when I just put a meaning here, remembered, the king, the kingdom, I'm not really translating, I'm more glossing these words. Translation is a more kind of polished result than that. All right, and so now that we're going into our English translation, the first question we ask is, what do we start with in English? We start with our subject. So what is our subject? Our subject is Hamelech. What does Hamelech mean? The king. All right, so let's put that first in our English translation. The king. All right, now that we have our subject, is there any other part, we have our subject noun, is there any other part of the subject that is in this Hebrew sentence that modifies the subject? Is there some adjective? Well, we haven't done adjectives yet. Is there some temporal phrase? Well, we haven't done that yet. So there's nothing else in here that belongs to the subject. It's just a subject noun. So now we go to our predicate in English. What is our main verb? Main verb is Zachar. He remembered. Okay, we don't say the king he remembered. That would be redundant. We don't need the pronoun he because we have an explicit subject. So we already have the king, and so we just use remembered. The king remembered. All right, so we've got our subject and we've got our main verb. What's left in the Hebrew sentence? Well, we have a direct object that we need to add in. Well, where does the direct object go in English? It usually follows the verb immediately. All right. Sometimes you'll have an intervening adjective. The king fondly remembered the kingdom or something like that. But this is the only other part of our Hebrew sentence, so it's going to go right after the verb in our English translation. So our English translation would be the king remembered the kingdom, not remembered the king the kingdom, or he remembered the king, because that sounds like someone else remembered the king. Not he remembered the king the kingdom. English starts with the subject, the king, then our verb, remembered, and then whatever's left, the direct object, the kingdom. All right, that's where the word order comes into play, the difference in word order between English and Hebrew. If we look at number 2, lakakti na'ar, we ask, and we've already kind of gone through this, so we know that this is our verb. What's our gloss for this? Well, lakakti comes from lakach. It means took or seized or captured. It is the 1CS form. So if we don't have an explicit subject, which for first person singular, that would basically be ani or anohi, and we don't have those, so we can gloss this as I took. And then we have na'ar. Na'ar means a boy or a servant, something like that. But we also have to ask, what is the function of this noun in the sentence? Is it the subject? It can't be the subject because it doesn't agree with the verb in number. I'm sorry, in person. It does agree in number and gender, but it doesn't agree in person. Na'ar is not a first person noun. That doesn't make sense. So it can't be the subject. What else can it be? Well, it could be the direct object. If it's the direct object, why doesn't it have et? It doesn't have et because it's not definite. Et is not always there for the direct object. It's only there when the direct object is definite. All right, and so what that means is this, because it does not agree with the verb, it can't be the subject, but it can be the direct object. So we go to our English translation now. English. What does English ask for first? What's our subject? Well, we don't have an explicit subject, so we're going to use the stand-in pronoun I to represent the subject in English, because English has to have a subject. Hebrew doesn't, but English does. So we'll use I as our pronoun for the subject, and then we don't have anything else related to the subject, so now we need our verb, which is took. All right, so I took. Then what else do we have? Well, we have na'ar. We've already decided that that is a direct object, so where does the direct object go in an English sentence? It follows the verb. You could say I took boy, but that's bad English. So we say I took a boy. That is how we would say it in English. All right, and so you can start to see this process where the first kind of step in translation is to identify the words. So make sure that you understand what the word actually is before you even ask anything about its meaning or function. So zachar, this word, the root is zachar. It is a verb. Its meaning is going to be remember or to remember, but it's in the cal perfect. So we're going to have simple past tense action remembered. And it's in 3ms. So if we need a pronoun, it would be he remembered, but we're going to look for a 3ms pronoun as our subject, and sure enough, here we have it. All right. Then hamelech, that means king. Okay. But again, once we get through the meaning layer, then we have to ask the function layer. What is each word doing? Well, zakar is the action. It's the main verb. Hamelech is the subject. It is the one that does the action of the verb. Et hamalkut is the direct object. It is the thing that is remembered. Okay. So it is the object of this action. It is the thing that the subject is remembering. Same for number 2, lakachti. Lakachti is a verb. Its meaning, lakach, is take or seize. We don't have a subject, but na'ar, which means servant, is a noun, and since it doesn't agree, with lakachti, it can't be its subject, but it can be its direct object. So now we have the function, verb or main action, main verb action, and direct object. We've got all that. Same with number 3 all the way down. But then once we've got all those functions, now we can smooth out a translation by going to English and saying, what do we start with in English? We start with our subject. So let's pull our subject. Hamelech. Let's pull our subject, I pronoun, all the way through, and then you pull your verb, and then you pull your direct object. So it's not as translation is not as simple as just translating this word, then translating this word, and then translating this word and adding a period. That's not good translation. You're giving glosses for each of these words, but that does not mean that you've translated it because you've not asked the question of how is this word functioning in the sentence. So let's look at number 4 then. Again, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to expect. I'm not going to demand, but I'm going to expect, because of typical Hebrew word order, I'm going to expect that this first word is probably a verb. All right? So let's see if we can make sense of this word as a verb. How many letters does a Hebrew verbal root have? 3. How many do I have? I have 4 letters. This vav is a vowel letter, but a vowel letter is still a letter, so I have 4. Okay, so what's extra? If the root has 3 and I have 4, what do I need to take away to get back to the root? Well, in the cal perfect, we add suffixes to the root to conjugate a verb. So I probably need to take off a suffix. Since I've only got 1 extra letter, let's start with that letter. If I take off this shurik, or this vav, what am I left with? I'm left with shen lamed chet. Is that a word that I've learned before? It happens to be. I've learned shalach as took. So what does the shurik suffix do to the verb? What forms of the cal perfect, or form of the cal perfect, adds a shurik as a suffix? That's the 3CP form, okay? So I've already kind of translated this as sent, but when I understand that it's 3CP, I just keep kind of in parentheses in the back of my head the word they sent. All right, so I can kind of keep that over here as a gloss. But I am not translating yet, okay? I'm just inspecting the sentence. So now that I've fully parsed this, I can move on to the next word. Next, we have ha-elim. Now, when I get to a Hebrew word and it starts with a hey, I immediately think to myself, well, maybe, just maybe, we have a definite article here. Now, as I inspect closer, I realize, well, we don't have a patak dagesh. But we wouldn't expect a patak dagesh when the next letter is aleph, because aleph can't take a dagesh. And what happens when we put the definite article on a word that begins with aleph? Well, we get no dagesh and the patak lengthens to a kametz. Oh, well, then this is even more likely to be a definite article. So let's just take this off and look at elim. What do I see here? Well, the next thing that jumps out at me is this hirik yod mem suffix. I immediately recognize im as the plural ending for a masculine noun. So if I take eam off, what am I left with? Ale. Is ale a word that I've seen before? Yeah, that usually gets translated as God. So this would be gods, and with the definite article, it would be the gods. This is a noun. So as part of your gloss process, you will give an English meaning for this unit, the gods, but also make a note that this is a noun, okay? And you can even parse it out that this is a masculine plural noun. And now that we've fully parsed this word, we can move on to the next one. 8, okay? Well, remember, we talked about how 8 isn't exactly a word. It's almost more like a punctuation mark. And maybe not punctuation mark, but it's a function marker. And it's screaming, hey, look at me over here. Whatever comes next, that's your direct object. And it's going to be definite. So let's look at what comes next. And we'll kind of treat 8 hanavi as a one-word unit. Well, next we get hanavi. Again, anytime I see a word in Hebrew that starts with a hey, I think to myself, that could be the definite article. Let's look a little closer. And when I look a little closer, I see the patach dagesh. Well, it is possible but rare that you're going to have a Hebrew word that starts hey patach dagesh and it not be the definite article. So let's just go ahead and assume it is the definite article and see what else we can find out. If we take that off, we're left with navi. Is navi a word that we've learned? Navi is the word for prophet. So this word means the prophet, and it also is a noun, masculine singular. But we already know its function is direct object because 8 precedes it. So we can also put as sort of our kind of fact-finding data that this is not only the prophet, but it's also a noun. It's not only a noun, but it's a masculine singular noun. It's not only a masculine singular noun, it's a definite masculine singular noun. It's not only a definite masculine singular noun, it's a definite masculine singular noun functioning as the direct object. We know a lot about this word. Now that we've gotten through the sentence, we go to our translation stage. What language are we translating into? English. Okay, what does English look for first? What does English ask for first when it creates a sentence? What does it need first? English needs the subject first. All right, so what's our subject here? Do we have a subject? Well, let's first look and see if we have an explicit subject. We need a noun to function as the subject. Shalach or shalahu is a verb, so we can't use that. Ha'elim is a noun, that might work. And hanavi is a noun, that might work. Except hanavi won't work because it already tells us that this is reserved for use as a direct object, so it will not function as the noun. So the only possible word to function as a subject is ha'elim. Now, is it the subject, or is it just coincidental that it's here? Let's ask if it agrees with the verb in person, gender, and number. The verb is third person, common, plural. Common means it can take a subject of any gender, and plural means that the subject has to be plural. So, ha'elim, third person, it is plural. So this does agree with the verb. Again, that makes it likely that it's the subject, but it doesn't guarantee. Maybe there's another word in this sentence that functions as the subject, or maybe it's coincidental that this agrees with the verb, but this has a different function. Well, at this point in Hebrew, we've only learned 2 real functions of nouns in a sentence, the subject and the direct object. We already know hanavi is the direct object. The only thing left for this ha'elim to do is to be the subject. I think I said that backwards. We already know that et hanavi is the direct object. The only thing left for ha'elim to do is to be the subject. So, looks like this is our subject. So we're going to take this and put it into English first. The gods. All right. We got our subject. Now what does English want? What does English need after the subject to create a sentence? Well, we might look for adjectives or temporal clauses or that sort of thing, but we haven't learned those yet. So we're going to stop with the gods as our subject, and now we're going to look for our predicate. What is the first element of the predicate in English? Usually it's the main verb, okay? Especially in the simple sentences that we're doing here. So where's our main verb in Hebrew? Well, we talked about the only verb in this sentence is shalahu, so that must be the main verb. All right, so what does shalahu mean? Well, it means sent. It happens to be a 3CP, they sent, but we don't need they because we already have an explicit subject. We would only use the they pronoun for shalach if we didn't have an explicit subject. So just ignore the parenthetical they over here. The gods sent. Okay, great. So we've got a sufficient sentence in English. We've got a subject, we've got a verb, but we still have more Hebrew here. So we have to ask ourselves, okay, what's left in Hebrew? What is it doing? And where would we put that in our English sentence? Well, what's left is our direct object, the prophet. Where does the direct object go in an English sentence? Usually it's right after the main verb. So we're going to take the prophet, our direct object, and we're going to put it right after our verb, took. And so we get sent. I think I did that earlier with lakach, okay? We're going to have our subject, the gods. We're going to have our verb, sent. We're going to have our direct object, the prophet. If we were to translate this sentence word after word after word, we would translate it, they sent the gods, the prophets. And that's really misleading because in English, word order determines the function of a word in a sentence. So when we put the gods after the verb, we're saying that the gods is the direct object, but it's not the direct object in Hebrew. So we can't put it after the verb. We have to put it before the verb. All right. And so if we were to say they sent the gods, the prophets, actually in English, what that would mean, the gods wouldn't be the prophet. The gods wouldn't be the direct object. The gods would be the indirect object. We sent, parenthesis, we sent to the gods, the prophet. So that's like saying we sent the prophet to the gods. Okay, English will flip its direct object and its indirect object when the indirect object does not have a preposition. So instead of, we could say they sent the prophet to the gods, or if we want to take off that to, we'll flip the order. They sent the gods the prophet, okay? But you can see how that word order in English, the order that the words appear in, actually determines the function. So if you were to translate this sentence as, they sent the gods the prophet, you would be incorrectly identifying the gods as the indirect object rather than the subject, and you would incorrectly be, well, I guess it would still be correct that this is the direct object, but you would have the gods as functioning differently in English than it functions in Hebrew, and that's a mistranslation. All right. I know that that's a long and probably convoluted explanation of this difference in word order and difference in how sentences work between English and Hebrew, but let me see if in 1 minute I can summarize everything I said. Into trouble translating this word, then this word, then this word, then putting a period, is because the words in Hebrew can be in a lot of different orders. The order of the words doesn't matter in Hebrew. It doesn't determine what a word is doing necessarily. But in English, if you put this word first, then it's understood that the subject is here. If you put this word next, it's understood that this is the direct object. That's opposite from Hebrew. In Hebrew, the word after the verb is usually the subject, not the direct object. So we have to go through some steps. First, we have to identify each word and gloss it. Then we have to parse it. Actually, we probably have to parse it before we gloss it. We have to identify each word, parse it, gloss it, and then ask what its function is. What is it doing in the sentence? Is it the verb that's telling us the action? Is it the subject that's telling us who's doing the action? Is it the direct object, which is telling us who is receiving the action of the verb? Only then, once we've determined the function of each word, can we now transition to translation, where we go through and we ask first for the function. Give me the subject first. Okay, let's go find our subject, Hamelech. Okay, put the king in. Give me your verb next. What's our verb? Zakar, remembered. Okay, put remembered in. Okay, subject, verb. Then give me your direct object. Here's your direct object. We put that in. Same for number 4. What's your subject? We already decided in our parsing, in our function, that ha'elim. So give me ha'elim, the gods. All right, what's your verb? Shalahu. All right, sent. All right, what's your direct object? Et hanavi, the prophet. So you see how there's this 2-stage process to translation where we have to analyze the Hebrew sentence, and then we can shift over to asking for English translations. All right. Hopefully that's helpful. If not, let me know if you have any questions.